Hello and welcome to another motorcycling video. It's the winter months in Australia, in the southern hemisphere, and Goulburn's particularly cold in winter, so most people have probably winterised their motorcycle and put it away for the winter, but every now and again you get a fine day, and so take advantage of those when you can get them. In this video I'm going to talk about consumer law. So let me say first of all, I'm not a lawyer and I don't have any expertise that I can offer you in regard to consumer law. I should say at the outset that if there is an issue you have with that relates to consumer law, you should try and resolve it with the person people that you bought the item from, and if that's not bringing you any success, then it's of course time to consult lawyers and the ACCC and so on. The second thing I will say at the outset is that some of the information that I'm going to use in this video has come from John Cadogan, who runs the YouTube channel called Auto Expert. He reports on cars and things to do with the automotive industry, and has reported on each of these incidents that I'm about to relay to you as they relate to consumer law and behaviour by various motoring manufacturers in regard to consumer law. Now, probably the most important points to understand about consumer law in Australia is that no matter what warranties, guarantees, contracts, offers, or anything else like that a retailer or the seller of a good or an item might offer you, none of those things can override your statutory rights under Australian consumer law. What that simply means is that you have certain rights as established by consumer law, by legislation passed by the Australian Parliament and administered by the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission, often just called the ACCC, and nothing that a person who sells you a good or offers you a service can override or supersede or countermand those rights under Australian consumer law. And the second thing is that, as a general principle, an item that you buy has to be fit for purpose for what a reasonable person would consider a reasonable period of time. Now, how much is a reasonable period of time, you might ask? That's a bit like how long is a piece of string. But obviously your toaster that you buy for $20 or so from Kmart or somewhere like that isn't expected to last as long as a flat screen TV that you spend several hundred, if not several $1,000s on, which is not expected to last as long as a car that you spend tens of thousands of dollars on. So the reasonable period of time from the reasonable person is somewhat of a subjective test, but in the sense that you cannot go to the ACCC website or any other website to my knowledge and say, well, and ask the question, how long should my car last, and get an answer. It is, as I say, a reasonable period of time, what a reasonable person would expect as a reasonable period of time for that particular item. Now, in Australia, car manufacturers offer warranties between about 4 and 7 years now. Some of them have unlimited kilometres, some have a specified number of kilometres, but generally the warranties are between 4 and 7 years. In some cases with electric vehicles, the manufacturers offer a separate warranty on the battery, which can be up to 8 years depending on the brand and the model, and or 160,000 kilometres or unlimited kilometres. Now, it's important to read the fine print in those warranties and guarantees to see exactly what is covered and what it means. In some cases, the warranty says if the battery falls below 70% capacity in the period of time of the warranty, it will be replaced. In other cases, it may say other things. So be careful of the fine print and be aware that the warranties vary according to different brands and different models within the brand. But they are a subjective thing, and the manufacturer might say, well, we don't consider that to be a warrantable defect, and this is where your rights under consumer law become more important. So I'm going to tell you first of all some stories about the automotive industry and how they've treated various people at various times, and perhaps that'll help you to understand what I'm driving at. So the first of those stories relates to a young man who bought an LDV ute. Now this was some time ago, and he bought this LDV ute. He bought a brand new one, and he was naturally very proud of his purchase, and he drove his purchase every day to his work. His work was at a surf club on the Gold Coast, which is in the southeast corner of the state of Queensland. And yes, with the word coast in it, you can imagine that it was near the beach and it involved salt water and sand and things like that. Now, after a very unreasonable period of time, he noticed that his car was showing some signs of rust. He approached the dealer with a view to saying to them, well, look what's happening to my car. It appears to be rusting away, or it appears that there's rust in it. That doesn't seem like a reasonable thing after I've only had it a short time. Can you do something about it? Or words to that effect. Now, what we don't know next is whether the response from the dealer was based on the dealer's decision or a directive from LDV or somebody just being pig-headed, but they flatly refused. Their answer was no, this is not a warrantable problem. They explained it as not being a warranty problem by offering the following bits of information. They said that taking a ute, this particular ute, to the beach every day for your work was not what the ute was designed for, and therefore he was using it for a purpose that it wasn't intended to be used for. Now, the problem with that was several things. First of all, in all of the promotional material, advertising, on visual advertising, brochures and so on, a reasonable person was left with the impression that the LDV ute was as tough as nails and could take anything you could throw at it, and there were no places where you couldn't take it. You could take it off-road and it would be fine, and you could drive it as hard as you wanted, it would be fine. It was as tough as nails. So nowhere in the advertising material did it indicate, well, it's not actually as tough as nails when it comes to salt air, for example. Secondly, there was nothing in the owner's manual or any other material that he was given at the time of purchase of the vehicle that said, do not take this car near salty water or anything like that. There was anywhere in any information that he was given that suggested taking the truck to the beach, not actually into the water, but parking it at the parking lot near the beach was hazardous to the vehicle. The matter eventually found its way to the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal, who ruled against the dealer and ordered that they provide the young man with either a replacement truck or a full refund, whichever he preferred. In their judgment, they found that those two bits of information that the dealers had relied on were dubious at best. They noted that the dealership itself was apparently, as the crow flies, about 1 kilometre from the beach, and therefore all the vehicles on the lot were presumably going to be affected by the same salt air. They also noted, after bringing in some material specialists, that the materials made to use the truck, to build the truck, were of poor quality, and the rust proofing was either inadequate or improperly applied. Now, it's to be hoped that in the interim period, LDV have learnt their lesson of using better materials and applying better rust proofing and so on to the trucks that they're now selling to us. A second story involves a woman who bought a $250,000 Land Rover. Now, I'm not sure the particular model, but she bought this $250,000 Land Rover, and it seemed to spend more time being serviced than it did with her driving around doing the things that she had intended to do with it. So, again, she approached the dealer and basically said to them, this car's a dud. It spent more time in your workshop than it spent in my garage, and I think you should offer me a refund or a replacement vehicle. Again, we don't know whether the dealer was acting on their own or on orders from Land Rover, the corporation, but they declined to accept either of her offers. Again, it went to a legal process, and in the end, the legal process is found in favour of the owner of the car to say that yes, she did have a dodgy vehicle and that they were required to offer her either a replacement vehicle or a full refund, whichever she desired. Now, the interesting thing about that particular matter was that in defending themselves, not only did they incur the $250,000 refund on the vehicle or replacement vehicle, they incurred something like $650,000 in legal fees. So in total, they spent more than 3 times the value of the vehicle in defending themselves unsuccessfully against claims that were found to be valid under Australian consumer law. That is, that the vehicle that she had purchased was not fit for purpose and had not lasted what a reasonable person thought was a reasonable period of time. There is the infamous case of Ford, and I think it was the Ford Focus with the dodgy transmission, that when buyers returned to the dealerships complaining that the car was performing badly and there was something wrong with the transmission and so on, they were repeatedly told, no, there's nothing wrong with it, it's the way you drive it. And mock repairs were carried out until the ACCC took them to court and said that they'd engaged in deceptive behaviour and unconscionable conduct, and Ford were fined $10 million, and people were required to offer people remedies for the trouble that had been caused. 2 recent cases have come to my attention thanks to John Cadogan at Auto Expert. One involves a man who bought a rather expensive Mercedes-Benz, and apparently the steering wheel in his Mercedes-Benz was made of leather, but then laminated with Teflon. And after a very short period of time, the Teflon coating began to peel off and the steering wheel began to not look as pristine and as good as it should have done. Now, as you would, he approached the dealer and said, this doesn't look right. I've only had the car a short period of time. It's where my hands sit on the steering wheel. And can you do something about that? Again, we're not sure whether the dealer acting on their own or acting upon instructions from Mercedes, but they declined to do just that, and that which would have been to replace the steering wheel. He went to the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal, who eventually ruled against Mercedes-Benz and said that they had to replace the steering wheel. In the process, they briefed several legal counsel. They also brought in their own expert who suggested that among the causes of the steering wheel's delamination, which were not warrantable defects or structural defects, but were the result of the passenger's misuse, could have been caused by A, sweaty hands. How dare anyone's hands sweat when they're driving their car? B, the use of sunscreen. There were no warnings about not using sunscreen and then holding the steering wheel. C, possibly the use of hand lotions or moisturiser. Again, no warnings in the material anywhere about not using moisturiser or hand lotions and then driving the car. D, exposure to sunlight. I mean, after all, who knew that a car in Australia, and the steering wheel in particular, would be exposed to sunlight? Or possibly the use of a microfiber cloth to clean the steering wheel. Now, the 2 learned counsel for the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Appeals Tribunal dismissed those claims and said that Mercedes-Benz had to replace the gentleman's steering wheel, which was something like $250, and no doubt they incurred several times that amount of money in defending their claim. And then there's the story of BYD. Now, if you're not familiar with BYD, they are a Chinese manufacturer. That is, they're a manufacturer based in China. They're a Chinese company that makes motor vehicles, and they are particularly known for their range of electric vehicles, although I do believe they've now branched out into hybrids. One of their vehicles is the BYD Atto 3. And this story concerns a family that lived in Canberra and were early adopters and what some people might even call fanboys of the Atto 3. And when they saw one, they just had to have one. They ordered it, waited an interminable period of time, and finally took delivery of their precious Atto 3. They told everybody, no matter whether they asked or not, how great a car it was and how much they loved it, and couldn't stop talking about it till I suspect that their friends and family were sick to death of hearing about how good the Atto 3 was, until one day, 14 months into the ownership of this vehicle and only 33,000 kilometres on the clock, they were driving along the Tuggeranong Parkway, which is a major arterial road in the ACT leading to the southern suburbs and beyond to Cooma, and the vehicle simply just stopped. It didn't run out of petrol, didn't run out of juice or anything, it just stopped. And roadside assistance had to be called, and a flatbed brought in, and the Atto 3 hauled up onto the flatbed and driven away. After much back and forth between BYD and the owners, BYD suggested first of all that there wasn't a battery failure. They suggested that incorrect charging was the cause, and therefore it wasn't a warrantable defect, and so on. And this went back and forth for about 3 months before there was a resolution that was satisfactory to both people, except for the sour taste that it now left in the mouth of the family that had loved their vehicle to this point and couldn't tell you enough and how often how good BYD were, but now obviously don't have a kind word to say for them. Now, it's important to note here that, as I said, the length of time that vehicles are warranted for. In the case of BYD, they warrant their vehicle for, I believe it's 6 years or 150,000 kilometres, but please check the fine print if you have a BYD. They also warrant the battery, I believe it's for 8 years or 160,000 kilometres. So you would think that after only 33,000 kilometres, when the battery had decided it was no longer going to function, that period of time did not constitute a reasonable person's test of a reasonable period of time. It was not fit for purpose, and a replacement battery would have seemed to be the expedient option. I suspect BYD had a number of options, one of which was to say, well, okay, we will replace the battery under warranty, no charge. We will give you a replacement vehicle because we can't get a battery at the moment. And when we get the battery for this car, we'll sell it on the second-hand market. We'll give you your money back if you wish. But they chose to play hardball. As I say, we don't know whether it was a decision by BYD's importer or distributor or the BYD company itself, but it certainly, again, soured this family's experience with BYD. So it's important to note here that no matter what warranty, what guarantee, what incentives a vehicle manufacturer might offer you, they cannot override your statutory rights under consumer law. And so if you have a problem with your vehicle and you think that it's a reasonable within a reasonable period of time. Now, obviously, if your vehicle's 10 years old and got 150,000 kilometres on it, it's probably past the reasonable period test. If it's a year or 2 or even 3 years old, it's probably still within the reasonable period test. The other thing that's I think is worthy of consideration here is if you think about it, for the generation of families who can afford to buy a house, the house is the most expensive thing you'll ever buy, and it will appreciate in value. For those families, the second most expensive thing you'll buy is a car, and it will depreciate in value the moment you drive it off the lot. For those who can't afford to buy a house, and that's the generations that are growing up now, probably the most expensive thing you'll ever buy is a car, and as I said, as soon as you drive it off the lot, it's going to depreciate in value, and probably after about 3 years, maybe 4 years, it's going to be worth about 50% of what you paid for it. Nevertheless, the manufacturer is obliged under Australian, is not obliged, is required under Australian consumer law to fulfil their obligations to say that the item in question in the vehicle or the vehicle itself was either not fit for purpose or had not stood the reasonable period of time test, and offer you remedies, which could include replacement of the vehicle, refund of the price of the vehicle, or other remedies. I suggest to you, if you are in such a situation with a vehicle, that you try to resolve the matter with the dealer, and you're not successful. That's at the point where you consult legal counsel and get some legal advice from properly trained lawyers and people who specialise in consumer law. And before you sign or accept any deals from the dealer or the manufacturer, make sure that you have consulted a lawyer, and make sure that you are not being your consumer rights are not being voided by some deal that they're asking you to take, which says, here, look, we don't agree that there's a problem, here's some money, shut up and go away, and don't tell anybody we gave you money, and everything will be fine. So you might find that when you reach that point, or before you get to that point, that you're going to need to keep records of emails, keep the receipts of the services that you've had to the vehicle, and things like that, so that when you do come, or if you do get into the situation where you feel you're going to have to make one of these sorts of consumer-based claims that ends up in a legal setting, that you have evidence to support your claim, to say, well, I did everything they told me to do when they told me to do it. Here's the owner's manual. I've read it and I can't find any information that says I'm not supposed to take it to the beach. I've had it serviced regularly. Here are all the receipts for when I've had it serviced, and things like that. So there is a brief overview of Australian consumer law and your rights, and how they stand in regard to warranties, guarantees and such like that motor vehicle manufacturers might offer you. I should say that for the most part, I suspect that most people get pretty good service and pretty good deals from their either the dealer they bought the car from or the company that made the car, because they keep going back to that manufacturer and buying another one. In other words, if you bought one Toyota and you're happy with it, you'll go and buy another one. And the reason isn't necessarily because it's a great car or a great price, but because when you put it in for service, you got it serviced at a reasonable price. When something went wrong with it, they acknowledged it and fixed it and so on. If that didn't happen, you'd go to another brand straight away. But so there's my sort of take on Australian consumer law and your rights as a consumer. As I said, if you are in a situation like this, please consult legal counsel and get proper legal advice before you agree to anything that the dealer might offer you or the company that manufactured the vehicle might offer you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I hope you've learned something from today's video.